Catastrophic, Bill. That's the word that came to my mind as I researched this topic, and then as we talked to Mitch and Jarred, because boy, if you look up some of the stuff that happens, like what we talked about, the Mount Poly mine is the most obvious one, 2014 in British Columbia. And you look at the pictures and you think about what could happen here. Oh my gosh.
It's insane. This morning, first thing, before I really started diving in to make some notes, I was worried about my own river over here. It's like we're in a Hank Williams Jr. song in this part of the world because the Mississippi is basically dry. They've stopped barge traffic. And then I start looking at this and the threats on those boundary areas in the Pacific Northwest and the rivers that flow out of Canada. This is scary stuff, genuinely scary stuff.
Yeah, the scale, the amount of toxic sludge. I mean, Mitch said something. If this Copper Mountain mine fails, we're talking about the first community downstream being buried under 60 meters of toxic sludge. That's the town is gone. That's everybody there dies. That's unbelievable type stuff. And then by the time it hits the United States border in Washington, still several meters of toxic sludge. I can't imagine that. And I think hopefully this podcast will get people alert to this, and they'll start paying attention and thinking about this. There's multiple mines up above, the United States, Idaho, Montana, Washington, that hopefully folks will take a look at. And we had really good guests and some of the most knowledgeable people on this. So I hope folks will perk up and pay attention and enjoy this podcast.
Since 1936, the National Wildlife Federation has worked with hunters and anglers to pass the most important conservation laws in American history and to protect our sporting traditions. This podcast explores our history, our values, and the work we do to safeguard the fish and wildlife that fuel our passions. We are NWF Outdoors.
Howdy, folks. This is Aaron Kindle, and I'm here with my good buddy and side partner here for the podcast, Bill Cooksey. What's happening, Bill?
Hey, Aaron. It's finally fall down here in the south. Our leaves have changed and started dropping, and it was 28 degrees here on the banks of the Tennessee River this morning. So it feels like fall.
Good. Yeah, we're finally getting some of that here in Colorado. We're going to get some snow this weekend, which I'm happy about. It's fall. It's hunting season, and we need some cold. We're happy today to be talking, well, maybe not happy, but we have an interesting subject. It's always fascinating for me when natural resources issues cross boundaries, right? When it's state boundaries, tribal boundaries. And this one is interesting because it involves international boundaries. And, when you got natural resource issues that span international boundaries, that always creates a special kind of management considerations and issues. And we have two great guys today to cover this topic of transboundary mining. So first, let me introduce these guys, and then we'll get going. First, we have Jarred Michael Erickson, and he is the chairman of the Colville Business Council for the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Jarred, that was a mouthful. I hope I got it right. But he has several years of experience in tribal leadership and a deep passion for protecting the tribe's resources and lands. He's a devout hunter himself. We got to chat with him a little bit before we even started here, and he was telling us about some of his outdoor forays. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit more as we get going. But prior to being the chairman, he served as the presiding officer over the tribe's natural resource committee and also the fisheries committee. And he was a biologist for about 10 years in the tribe's fish and wildlife program, and he has a degree in biology. And he's a descendant of both Chief Barnaby, I hope I'm saying that right, Jarred, let me know, and Chief Tenasket. And he really likes to work with young audiences and trying out different things on different media platforms. So he'll be an awesome guest for us today. How's it going today, Jarred? I should say before I introduce our next guest.
That was a mouthful. No, I appreciate you let us be here and take part in this. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. We're interested to hear what you have to say today. And then we have Mitch Friedman. And Mitch is a guy I actually met, Mitch, I probably a dozen years ago. I was working for Trout Unlimited, and we were working on some responsible off-highway vehicle issues. And Washington State was doing a lot of interesting stuff up there. And Mitch and I met, but we didn't see each other for a while. And then I started working for NWF, and Mitch is executive director of Conservation Northwest, which is an NWF affiliate. And he founded that group back in 1989. And Mitch is an accomplished, outdoorsman and natural resources mind. He has a degree in zoology, and he now lives in Seattle. He's a founding board member of the Wildlands Network. He's been recognized with awards from places like Sunset Magazine, Society for Conservation Biology. He's an author of a couple books. And I was reading this, Mitch, and this was maybe the most impressive. Back in 2003, and we'll see if it's still true, Washington Law and Politics magazine named him as one of the 25 smartest people in Washington. Do you think that's still true, Mitch?
It's still true that they did that. It's not that I am that.
Well, good. Thanks for joining us. We're here to talk about some mining issues.
How do I get on that list?
I don't know if you have to. I don't know if you have to go politic and campaign or what, but maybe Mitch can fill us in. And we're here to talk about transboundary mining. There's a mine up above Washington, and beyond that, there's several mines that are up in the headwaters that are in Canada that the rivers and the waters flow into the United States and into tribal lands and some of these areas we're going to be talking about. And that provides a really unique perspective about, what do we do about that? We obviously don't have jurisdiction. Our advocacy maybe isn't as powerful for other governments. So we want to talk about that. But first, what we do every time we have one of these podcasts is just ask our guests and talk a little bit about ourselves, what we've been doing outside, because really the whole reason we do all of this is because we like to take care of the places that we enjoy being outside so much. So first we'll start with Jarred. Jarred, what have you been up to outdoors?
Personally or work-wise?
Well, either.
So,
getting out there.
Obviously, I do a lot of hunting and fishing, right? And salmon fishing, or salmon season's kind of slowed down, I guess. Or it's kind of, our seasons have ended at Chief Joseph Dam, where we have access to still fish salmon. But work-wise, we've been working on the reintroduction of salmon above Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee Dam. That's been a big thing we've been working on. We've already had fish produced in the Sampoa River. We've been doing work on the Okanagan, which is the Similkameen River, where the river that flows by Copper Mountain Mine flows in the Okanagan. We spent millions of dollars there. Traditional territory of our Okanagan tribe, which Chief Tenasket that I go back to was one of the chiefs of. So doing a lot of work with salmon reintroduction is the main thing, and some wildlife work as well. We did lynx reintroduction in the kettles. They just transported 3 more last week, I believe, from Canada. Some of this is staff-wise, but as far as the tribe goes, a lot of things we've been working on, stuff like that. So a lot of work with Mitch too, here and there. We always find ways to cross paths, I think. Recently, we had a Transboundary Mining Conference, kind of on this issue in particular, but also other tribes from some BC. I guess they were Alaskan, right? Alaskan tribes is transboundary, but I didn't realize some of the issues they're having mining-wise too. That's transboundary as well. They start in Canada, then flow into their respected area, and I was unaware of how many are impacted, how many new mines are being proposed, how many are existing, ones that are, I guess, now abandoned or closed, but still have impacts that they're, as far as maybe with leaching or some other things into the watershed. So anyways, I've mostly been doing on salmon stuff. And
well, good. Sounds like you've been busy at work. Hopefully you're getting out and hunting and fishing a little bit too.
As much as I like.
Well, what about you, Mitch? You been outside doing something fun?
Yeah. Though these are kind of strange days. It's been a warm, dry, early fall, and I've had a couple trips. Just a couple weekends ago, I hiked into Nooksack Cirque up in the North Cascades, which long ass days, like 17-mile, half of it on cobble, crossing the the river 100 times, but the river, you're right up there where it's glacier fed, but it was low and warm, pretty easy crossing. And I had a trip like that in the Western Olympics about a month ago, where, just rivers lower and warmer than we're used to, almost to where, some of the rocks are getting a little slick with algae. And then this last weekend was opening weekend for Modern Firearm for deer here in Washington. And I usually would spend that weekend out near where Jarred lives, out in the central part of the state in the Okanagan, just because it's gorgeous there this time of year. But things kind of in the plans fell apart, so I wasn't able to pull that off, but I thought I would at least feed the freezer. I went up to Samish Island on Sunday, thought I could sneak up, get a blacktail, be back in time for the Seahawk game. But it's about, I don't know, 70 miles from here. And so, and I drive an electric vehicle, a Leaf. So it involved a recharge in a place where where the charging infrastructure wasn't so good. The one or two quick charge, the supercharged throw the ions at you or electrons that fit my car weren't working. And so I spent like most of the time trying to get the car charged, and upshot is no deer. And I was listening to the Hawks game on the radio, at least the first 3 quarters driving home. So kind of a bust of a day. And okay, one more thing. We've got smoke here. I mean, normally we'd have had rain for 2 or 3 weeks at this point. We're still in our summer drought until this Friday when rain is due. And there's fires burning, on the west side, even in some of the wet forests, and awfully smoky. That affected the deer behavior a bit too.
Well, we can't wait to see the photo of a little blacktail buck hanging out the back of your Leaf there. That'd be one we wouldn't see very often. So we'll be ready.
Yeah, I don't think an elk or a moose would work.
I don't think so. Well, let's dive into this topic here. I mean, I think first, what we ought to do for our listeners is just describe, the landscape, the place. Jarred, it'd be cool to hear a little bit about, your traditional territories and traditional uses there. I think there's that connection to the land is really important as we discuss this and historical uses. So maybe you can start us off with just, tell us about the place we're talking about today.
All right. So the Similkameen River, I don't know, I guess for listeners, it flows out of Canada down into the Okanagan River. Obviously, our tribe is on this side of the border. Most of our tribes were not most, but I believe three were transboundary tribes. So Okanagan, Colville, and Sinixt, which those are my 3 tribes that I come from, actually. So all my tribes I come from are cross-boundary tribes. Obviously, not recognizing the border, but we're kind of have to deal with it nowadays due to international stuff. So traditional territory of our Okanagan tribe, I kind of touched on that a little bit earlier. There's multiple chiefs in the Okanagan tribe, multiple ones in Canada as well. Like I mentioned, I go back to Chief Tanaska, who's one of them. We have a Chaptique story on the Similkameen River. So there's another thing we have going on hand in hand with this is also the potential removal of Enlow Dam we've been working on. We've been doing some core sampling with USGS, right, Mitch? Has been doing that. They're doing a safety inspection of the dam to see, its current state. It was built in 56. Does that sound right? 56 in the 50s. I can't remember exactly. But it hasn't been used for years due to, or hasn't been electrified since the 50s. I can't remember. Does that sound correct? That's what it was. Sorry, I can't remember when it was built exactly, but it was used for mining camps back in the day. And so it hasn't been used in years once those mining camps have use for it anymore. And so it's kind of just been a structure that's been impacting the river. Obviously, a lot of sediments building up behind the dam as well. So we're kind of working hand in hand with that. We have Coyote Falls right below the dam is one of our Chaptique stories that we're not allowed. And I know working with some other tribes. Their Chaptique stories are similar. They can't fish above those falls. A lot of it's because some depend on the story. It's kind of the end of days if you do or you're not. But also we've been working on getting fish above there. Not us like actually creating ways for them to get above there. But once that is removed, we actually have fish, Chinook even, which have a lower jump height than steelhead, actually below between the falls and the dam. So we know fish can get above there. There's a lot of work with steelhead. Some of these last areas of with climate change for them are in these northern upper reaches, right? And so the colder water. And so we hopefully, if we can get that removed, we'll have some more habitat for steelhead and potentially Chinook as well. But so I mean, that's kind of the area for people to think about. It's they kind of think of pristine waters. You kind of think of the Similkameen. We've done a lot of sockeye work as well in the Okanagan, which this flows into. This last year, they were predicted to have 600,000 Chinook run up the Columbia, and I think they hit close to that. I'm not sure on the exact actual numbers, but that was the prediction models, and we've spent millions and millions of dollars our Fish and Wildlife program on the Okanagan specifically. And I used to do some work when I was before I was a biologist as a technician on the Similkameen as well. We did some work. We were jaw tagging with the state just a little below Enlow down there, and I won't go into it yet, but there's some funny stories there with that one. The work that was done, but we do some of these beach seine sets just to get collect the salmon so we can then get them in a smaller area and jaw tag them. And anyways, I had 250 in one beach seine set around. There's a lot of salmon that use that, especially that lower Similkameen. But
I think Chairman Erickson lays out a good frame for this conversation. We could talk about poorly regulated mining in British Columbia, but really what we're talking about is the need and the right for clear, clean, cool, productive rivers that flow across the border. And that's a common theme, not just on the Similkameen, which flows out of the east side of the Cascades in south central British Columbia, and then flows kind of southeast into the Columbia River system. But it's also true in the rivers of southeast Alaska, on the Elk Kootenai River. It flows from British Columbia into northwest Montana. All of these systems have mines or mining threat in their headwaters in British Columbia. And, if we're going to have healthy fisheries and clean water for the indigenous communities that live downstream along them, or just, as a matter of international relations in the states for Alaska, Washington, Idaho, Montana, we need those mines to be operated to higher standards so that the water's clean and that, we could get rid of the dams and the other obstructions to fish and not have to worry that the salmon and steelhead that return to these upper watersheds will, have to combat heavy metals.
Well, let's talk about it a little. I mean, I think one other thing I want to grab before we even jump into this Copper Mountain mine and the tailings impoundment and things is just like maybe describe the fish and wildlife that are living up here. I mean, obviously we've got the salmon issues, and I think it can't be overstated enough that the kind of resources we're dumping into keeping salmon alive, right? And to contradict that with bad management of mining and any other thing, right? I mean, salmon are, again, can't be overstated their importance to the economy, to history, to tradition, to just everything there. It's like the way of life in the Northwest. And, when I've looked at this, it's Southeast Alaska has these issues too. And the ocean fishery there and returns, and there's so much to it. But, some of the other things I think we don't talk about because of the importance of salmon are, all the wildlife that relies on these areas. And, I don't think I want to, if I knew I was going to go harvest an elk and it was potentially drinking out of, mine contaminated waters, that would certainly give me pause Can we talk a little bit about maybe some of the other? Are people talking about that too? Is that an issue?
Absolutely. Jarred and I just a few weeks ago were at a conference in Wenatchee in Eastern Washington where we had together representatives of 16 different tribes and tribal coalitions from Alaska to Montana, and the federal and state regulators and others talking about this issue, and had the opportunity to hear from elders, not just about how aquatic first foods, not just trout and salmon, but even whitefish or mussels, that these are traditional and culturally important foods to these communities, and they've not been able to consume these resources, to eat fish from rivers like the Similkameen for a generation because of the mining impacts. The same thing applies to ungulates, and to hear a traditional knowledge keeper, like there's an elder of the Upper Similkameen Indian Band who talked about so many of the places that he's loved over the years have been impacted by logging and mining and the degradation of the water quality. It makes you cry. And then a council member from the Lower Similkameen Indian Band who happens to also be a rancher, and she talked about her cattle that drink from the river and what she has to do to try to keep them healthy. So it's an issue that touches everything, because we know that the water flows through everything. There isn't anything that doesn't rely on the water. But this also, just to broaden it a little bit, Aaron, we work on a whole bunch of issues in this terrain right now. Biologists from Jarred's tribes, the Colville Confederation, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance, which is on the BC side, but the Okanagan tribe, that's one of the 12 tribes in Jarred's reservation, and my staff working together to trap lynx just east of the Okanagan River in British Columbia, and translocate them to the Colville Reservation on the Washington side to restore a population of lynx in Northeast Washington in the Kettle Range. We've moved 8 or 9 lynx already this year. We moved 9 last winter. Our goal is 10 a year for 5 years. Working on grizzly bear recovery. Just yesterday and the day before, I was up in that territory meeting with the Similkameen bands, and we were talking about grizzly bears a little bit. And one elder was talking about, they call the grizzly bear trail, where bears move from just north of the border, kind of from east to west to the North Cascades seasonally, and then return. And there's a town along the Okanagan River, a city, Kelowna, and then Kelowna is the Insulshan word for grizzly bear. And these places and their names have meaning for the plants and animals and fish, and the way that the indigenous people, the First Nations and tribes, interacted with these biological communities, these resources over the centuries. So it's a very rich area. For us, the Similkameen River is part of the North Cascades. It's part of a wild and what can be very healthy ecosystem, a place where we can indefinitely maintain the wildness that is our heritage, including all of the native species.
That kind of denotes it right there, right? If you're talking about critters like lynx and grizzly bear and stuff, you need big wild country for that. This isn't somewhere
And
near
connected.
town. Yeah,
Big,
big
wild, and
connected country. So that ought to give folks an idea.
We all live downstream from other people, and we all live upstream from other people. So wherever you are in the country, you can understand these issues to some extent. And down here, we see plenty of fights between states and even landowners over water uses and what people do and how it impacts others. But we don't hear much about this issue in my part of the country, just until there's something awful that happens. It doesn't make the news on the national basis. So, but when getting ready for this, I was going online and looking at articles and videos and photographs, and seeing photos of the mines reminds me, and a lot of people my age and older will remember this in Kentucky, Alabama. I spent a lot of time in the coal mining hills of Alabama when I was a kid, when strip mining was the way they mined coal. And it was the ugliest blight on the landscape, and you knew it was doing harm. And over time, they cleaned that up and things got better, and that's a beautiful area of the country. But it was a mess, and it reminded me of that. So can y'all talk a little bit about the mines themselves, how it works, and what makes them such a problem, potential problem, especially?
Yeah. So this particular mine that we're focused on now, the Copper Mountain Mine in the headwaters of the Similkameen River, just upstream of a town called Princeton in south central British Columbia. It's one of the largest mines in Canada. It's a giant pit in the mountains. You can see it from the highways you drive by on Highway 3. It's what you think of when you think of a big mine. And the process is, it's fairly low grade ore. I think there's a bit of gold and other things, but mostly it's copper. It's been in operation since the 1970s. They shut it down in, I think, the 80s or 90s, and then they brought it back online just about 15 years or so ago. And the process is you blast the walls of the pit, a couple thousand feet below, the surface, and then front end loaders pile the stuff into giant trucks that then make the trip up the ramp, up the hill to the processing facility, where the rock is crushed into just, smaller, manageable size. And then there's a wet chemical process that extracts the mineral. And that means that the residue is a wet, chalky thing that gets piped out and has to be managed forever, right? Because it's a little bit toxic. You can't put it in the river. And so the way they manage these tailings, this waste, this wet waste product, they run it through what are called cyclones that spray the wet stuff. They separate the wet from the drier stuff, and they spray the wet stuff into the middle of a so-called pond, a tailings management facility, a lake. And they spray the dry stuff in the other direction. So imagine two mountains, a valley, the headwaters of a couple creeks running in different directions, with two mountains, one on either side. To use that valley to store, in theory, forever, this waste product, you have to put a cork in both sides, not just one, but both sides. And that's what they've done here. There's two giant earthen dams on either side. And what those dams are made of is that kind of drier tailings material that they spray out. And those two dams at the Copper Mountain Mine that contain the tailings are each taller than any building in downtown Vancouver and all but a few buildings in downtown Seattle. And they've got a permit. They go up about 5 meters a year, that because they're very actively mining. Their present permit allows them to do that for about 5 more years. But the mining company, Copper Mountain Mine, is trying to get a permit to expand operations and raise those dams a few hundred feet more. If they got that permit and did that, the resulting dams, 10, 20 years from now, would be the second and third highest mine-related dams, tailings dams, in the world. So you're looking at these things. On Monday, looking through the smoke from the highway, seeing one of the dams that's just 5 miles from this town of Princeton. And it is a massive high thing. It's unimaginable. And it's just made out of these sprayed tailings. And so you've got two issues that we should talk about on the call. One is, what's the quality of the water in the river downstream? What makes its way out of those tailings ponds into the river through seepage, through, getting through the rocks one way or another? And the other one is, what happens if one of those dams fails?
Those are issues. That's for sure.
A little bit.
Yeah. Let's kind of talk about two of those things. One being, we'll talk about the transboundary mining issues and how that just, complicates management. But also, first, let's talk about the risks. Like, what are we worried about, and what will happen if this, because I know there's some corollaries here, right? There's been some other big ones. I know the Mount Poly one up there in BC was if you look at the pictures of that, it's just clearly, wow. What does that mean? Are we looking at the same kind of thing? What's going to come out of this place if these dams were breached? What exactly are we thinking about could happen if we don't appropriately take care of this?
I'll use a lot of references to the Upper Columbia because a lot of these issues are similar. So I won't go into details about Tecominco, but we had Tecominco, which is a transboundary issue we had with pollution. From them, they're a big mining company, pumping stuff into the river for years in the Upper Columbia. So we've been dealing with a lot of the impacts from that. But just as an example, like you talk about, right, pristine waters and not being able to utilize animals or fish because of water quality. So we have a lot of warnings in the Upper Columbia, a lot of recommendations that pregnant women don't eat the fish. You're limited to a certain number of fish per week because of the pollutants. And so what I don't want to see happen is the same thing with our, salmon or anadromous, right? But if there's production of them and your juveniles are getting impacted by those, then they carry those with them, on their way out. So we'll make sure that not only our resident fish populations are healthy, but our anadromous, as their first year or so in the river system. So I don't want to see that happen to the Similkameen or the Okanagan with impacts from this mine in particular. So we've dealt with some transboundary issues. I'm not going to talk more about Tecominco because we're still kind of working through some of that, but I just want to make that as an example that we're dealing with some issues in the Upper Columbia could be similarly related to if something was happening here, but on maybe even a worse impact due to if there was a failure. We hope that never happens, right? But then Mitch now, I guess, could talk a little bit more about the what ifs, and hopefully you guys did some research and seen some breaches of tailings dams and seen, some of the impacts that can happen. So you have an idea. If not, maybe some of the viewers can Google some up themselves to see, because they can be pretty catastrophic. So we hope that doesn't happen. Fingers crossed. But I'll let Mitch talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we should circle back to that issue later in the call. It's an interesting area of policy and law, transboundary. It's about diplomacy and laws. What can neighboring countries do to impact or limit or influence activity in their neighboring country to reduce downstream effects within the country. But to your question, Aaron, in the show notes, I'll provide you links to some resources, but one of the links I suggest people look at are a couple studies that the Colville Tribes and Conservation Northwest jointly funded and contracted, and they're on the Colville Tribes website, that looked at two things. One, what's the likelihood of one of those tailings dams failing? And then secondly, what happens if one of them fails? And our contractor, a PhD out of Utah, an engineer named Stephen Emmerman, who's studied tailings dams around the world, is an expert. And he referenced studies that Copper Mountain Mine itself had paid for, their annual, dam safety reviews and things like that, their contractor reports. So here's a little bit of a scary thing. There are so many mines and so many tailings dams and so many just industrial facilities that are dangerous, not just in British Columbia and Canada, but all over the place, that there aren't enough experts, there aren't enough engineers to go out in interdisciplinary teams and visit these places and get all their questions answered and tell you, Aaron, the answer to your question. You want to know, is this dam safe? The best way to do it is to have the smartest, most experienced people go visit it, learn everything they can, challenge one another, get all their questions answered, and give you the answer to your question. It's safe or it's not, or what the risk is. There aren't enough people like that. And so some engineers came up with a process that allows kind of a proxy to that. You go through a bunch of questions and answers using available published materials, and at the end of that, it pops out an answer. What's the risk, the annual probability of failure of that particular thing, in our case, these tailings dams. So Emmerman went through that process with the 2 dams at Copper Mountain, using, again, their own resources, their own studies. And his conclusion was that the annual probability of failure is between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000, so somewhere about 0.045. That seemed like a broad range, in theory. What that lands on is like the odds in any given year are maybe 1 in 200 that thing's going to collapse. And given the size of those dams and the amount of wet semi-toxic material they confine and the proximity of human communities downstream, the Canada Dam Association rates those dams at Copper Mountain Mine as extreme, which means that if one of them were to fail, more than 100 people would die. And international standards for engineering are that dams in that kind of category, that dams that would have such a grave consequence if they failed, should have no more than 1 in 1,000,000, or at least 1 in 100,000 likelihood of failing. Think about that. If you could buy a lotto ticket that would save at least 100 people, right? That would make you rich enough to do amazing things, and your odds of success were between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000, you'd buy 1,000 damn tickets. You'd spend all your money on that because the probability is that high. So it is completely untenable that these dams have a probability of failure that, between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000. And then the second study we funded was modeling on what would happen if one of the dams failed. And there's an animation that I'll also include in the show notes, a 2-minute YouTube.
Yeah.
But the upshot, they ran, I think it was 68 model runs with different scenarios, from a 10% breach to a 70% breach, how much of the dam material. And the way these things fail, Aaron mentioned Mount Poly, that was in 2014, a mining tailings dam in the BC in the Chilcotin, central British Columbia, failed just because they built it on top of glacial soils. They didn't really know well the soils that were beneath it. And so that dam that failed was only 40 meters high. It was, less than a quarter as high as either of the Copper Mountain dams. And you can see on video, it just liquefies. It just slides out because the underlying soil, not the stuff that they built, but the stuff they built on, just started to slide because of the pressure, the weight of the dam had gotten big enough, and it just disappeared, went downstream. And that's happened a bunch of times around the world with this type of a dam, upstream dam construction. It's not even legal to use that type of dam construction in a lot of countries in the world, but Canada still allows it, BC still allows it. And if that were to happen, so the animation that you'd see at the YouTube link I'll include, is a scenario of a 40% breach, kind of not a worst case, but a mid-range scenario. And the town of Princeton, within about an hour or hour and a half, would be covered in about 60 feet of toxic slurry. And then it would continue on. It's about 65 kilometers to the U.S. border. And that wall of muck that would still be about 2 meters deep where it crossed the border, it would displace all the water in Palmer Lake by the Washington state town of Loomis, a gorgeous place. So, this valley of organic orchards and vineyards, just the most idyllic place. It's one of my favorite places in the world, this Similkameen, would be, for generations, maybe forever, would be semi-toxic even after you'd pulled out the bodies.
I'm not best and brightest, but I just can't help but think dams don't get stronger over time. There has to be so much constant maintenance, just even with our TVA dams. They have a life expectancy. If you don't do a lot of maintenance work, they're going to fail eventually. Is that the case here, where we shouldn't expect it to get better unless there's a serious change?
You're totally right. And I'm going to mention two things, and I'm going to try and be a little briefer. There's critical equipment that goes in these dams that, let the engineers know their condition and the risks. One type of equipment is called piezometers, and it measures, the water table within the dams. And there's about 50 of them between the two dams at Copper Mountain. And I think less than a quarter of them are functional right now. And then seismometers. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing these things right, but that, measures seismic activity. And I think one of 7 that's been installed is functioning right now. So first of all, maintain your dam equipment and have 24/7 monitoring, have the best engineers. Take this stuff seriously. They're not doing that at Copper Mountain. They're slow walking it. And that's probably pretty typical. And a second, more to your point, more to your question, in that Emmerman report that will be linked to in the show notes, there's a whole section about the long-term risk of these things. There's published literature by engineers about what happens. A mine's only active for 20 years. A civilization is only active for how many hundreds or thousands of years. And these tailings are permanent. And basically, the published scientific, the engineering literature says that the rate of failure is 100%. The variable is time. It's inevitable that these things are going to fail at some point. Is it in 10 years, 50 years, 200 years, 5,000 years? Are people living downstream or not? Are salmon still around or not? We've got to do a much, much better job. We cannot leave this legacy. And there are technologies, they're more expensive, but there are ways of getting our critical minerals without creating time bombs for the future.
Boy, Mitch, you paint a somber picture. Sometimes we get to have fun on this podcast, but this one's hard to think about when you think about anything, on the scale you're talking about. Even a low, 20% breach would be just catastrophic. Jarred, maybe if you wouldn't mind, give us the tribal perspective and, kind of the rights to clean water, the historical rights to the fish here, and then the work you've done, how all that intersects and kind of, determines your perspective on what this issue looks like.
Yeah. So, kind of ending on what Mitch said, or kind of elaborate on it towards the end, he talked about how short a period of time we really are here in the scheme of things, right? We're always taught growing up from our elders to think 7 generations ahead, right? You think of my children, my grandchildren. What am I leaving them? Am I leaving it better or worse off than when I got here? The work I try to do, I try to leave it better off, right? Like I want salmon here for my kids. I want salmon here for everyone, not just the tribe, but for everybody. I want them as a species. Salmon have a right to clean water. The 4-legged have a right to clean water. The winged, the insects, everything has a right to clean water. Water is what sustains all of us. Without it, none of us would be here. That includes all the animals we eat. So, we're not asking for a lot, right? Mitch is talking about some of these things. Like we understand it's not that we're in support of mining, but we also understand with climate change and the way the world's moving towards more clean energy and trying to think of better ways to do things. I still argue with this though. There's always impacts from clean energy one way or another, right? You do one thing, there's impacts to another, but is there a way to do it better? Is there, you know what I mean? Like there still might be impacts, but how do you mitigate those best? And with this, it's like, man, simple things like the monitoring systems on the dam, right? We're in a seismic area. Like those should be things that could, potentially save people's lives due to what, they get with those monitors. I mean, town of Princeton, right, Mitch, is just down river over there. Like, what warning signs can we give them quick enough so there isn't loss of life? You know what I mean? Or we hope this never fails, knock on wood. But how do we do a better job, right? And just simple things like those mining companies make a lot of money. These seem like real simple things that should just be, standard, right? I mean, I'd be if I'd have a weigh on my conscience knowing I was the owner of that or people at that mine, that it would just weigh on my conscience knowing if something did happen. Everyone hopes nothing happens, but I mean, it's like Mitch said, it's just the time. How much time does it take? Was it in our lifetime? Is it down the road? Eventually something will happen. Something will give. Any infrastructure we put in as humans, Mother Nature will take out eventually one day. It's just a matter of time. I mean, it's like you mentioned, Bill, I believe, right? Bill, is that your?
Yes.
Okay, I'm bad with names, but I can see your last name. But like Bill mentioned, like it's just without proper maintenance, even of concrete structure dams that take a lot of money and maintenance, but not let alone tailings dams. So a lot of these just take time and money, and if you don't, it's a matter of time before something happens to them. So.
Howdy, listeners. For more great content, check out NWF Outdoors social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Connect with us. We want to hear from you. Send us your ideas for podcast guests and questions in the comments.
And for even more excellent content, here's a message from our partner podcast.
Hey everyone, this is Marcia Brownlee from Artemis Sportswomen. We know you love awesome stories about hunting, fishing, and conservation, so head on over to the Artemis podcast. You'll meet adventurous, accomplished women who are redefining conservation through their lives in the field and on the water. Filled with humor, audacity, empathy, and intelligence, Artemis brings you new voices and introduces you to women from all walks of the sporting community. Find Artemis wherever you get your podcasts.
So is there a active, and I think I know the answer to this, but crew or group that's working on talking to the mining companies about what they want or advocating for certain things? Maybe you guys can spell that out. Like, what do we want right now to do the best we can to safeguard downstream and the communities, the salmon, all these things? What are we asking for currently? And what do those conversations look like with the company?
Key concept is free and prior informed consent. In British Columbia and a lot of Canada, that there were not Indian wars fought, there were not Indian treaties signed, and so the Canadian Supreme Court has recognized rights and title of First Nations to the land, to their territories, and for the rest of our lives, the courts and the governments are going to be working out what that looks like. But these communities, like the upper and lower Similkameen bands, the ones that live there, territories overlap. There's a bunch of different indigenous bands that, claim, for instance, Copper Mountain as territory. But the one that's closest is the upper Similkameen Indian Band. They're a very small tribal community, not a lot of resources, but a lot of concern. And they've hired some exceptional consultants, and they've had a long-term relationship with the mine, but it's not been a great relationship. They feel like they're not listened to. Is the company just checking a box by checking in with them? Sometimes they deluge them with documents. Oh, you want to know what we're up to? Here, I'm going to back up a truck of documents. Good luck. We'll hear from you when you've read all this. So because of these reports that the Calvo tribes and Conservation Northwest had put out and the fuss raised over it, there was a big meeting at the Lower Similkameen Band office a week ago. with government and company officials, and the ongoing dialogue. And, the band's leadership feel like they're being heard maybe a little bit better now. But that's the kind of, if the system were to work, Aaron, you'd have proper regulations. In British Columbia, they don't require environmental assessments for most industrial facilities. They're updating those regulations now, those requirements. But Copper Mountain Mine has never gone through an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. And even with the, iteratively updated, the regulations as we think they're going to likely be when the dust is settled, that mine expansion that I mentioned a few minutes ago, where they would add a few hundred feet to their dams and dig more holes, that would not require an environmental assessment. It's just the difference between how BC's regulations are and what we require on our side of the border. They do that without, oversight. And, how much bonding, how much money do these companies have to put up front to cover the costs of any accidents? So on Mount Poly, I think the public cost of the cleanup and the damage was, tens of millions, of which the company, Imperial Metals, has paid basically none to date. If they had been required up front to pay a bond, then the government would just take the money out of the bond after the fact. And so these are some of the regulations that we want changed that give the First Nations and the downstream communities and the resources a fighting chance, a level playing field. But then the better communication where the First Nations are heard and their concerns are addressed. Those are some of the things we're working for here.
This is a great discussion. I've always loved the reasonable man theory that, we talk about in courts and that sort of thing. And this all sounds so reasonable. You're not saying we have to quit mining. We can't get at natural resources. You're recognizing the realities of the world. And it sounds like you're just asking for very reasonable things to be done. So with that in mind, what can be done and what maybe can even people listening to this, how can they have a place in helping it happen?
I would say, yeah, right. As far, especially if you're in BC, right, or in Canada, if this is going to impact you, or or just you have concern of it because you're hearing these things that there is no environmental assessments required or impact statements, right? And so, how could you voice to your legislators for change? I know, us, the Colville tribe, we have our Sinaiks tribe within that, so we've won our rights back as recognized as Indigenous peoples of Canada. So we're kind of semi reestablishing a government in Canada. So we've been doing a lot of work and having meetings to start some of these conversations as Sinaiks, just overall. This isn't Sinaiks area over here in Okanagan, but you know what I mean? But it's all in BC. So we've been thinking of ways of how we can better engage the BC provincial government to talk about some of these things, to try to get some changes happening. But people personally, I think they can contact their representatives. They can be like, hey, so we don't have any oversight over this, or we're not, what are we doing to better if something was to happen, right? Because they could be someone even just downstream of there in Princeton or one of these little communities that could be impacted. But not just them, right? There's multiple mines in Canada, so multiple people should be worried if they're downstream of one, because there's always that potential, like Mitch mentioned, if it's a tailings dam for a failure, or what is that impacting my water quality, right? As far as that goes. And so contacting your legislators, joining, there might be some groups to join that are already working on some of these issues. Mitch might know more about some of them. I'm not aware of, but as far as on that side of the border, on this side of the border, we're doing the best we can. And I know helping with Conservation Northwest, some of their pushes that they've been doing. I know they're get private funding or get donations, right, Mitch? Or I don't know how you can talk a little bit more about how they can maybe help with you guys as well. But we're trying to do our part of the part. So we're tribal government's a little different. So, but
the National Wildlife Federation is playing a role. In early December, Chairman Erickson and a member of his council and I and four of the leaders of the Upper Similkameen Band and the president of the Haida Tlingit tribe in Southeast Alaska and a couple leaders from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe over in Montana. We're all going to go to D.C., have appointments with, the senators and reps, also State Department, Department of Interior, probably also the Canadian Embassy, and do what we can. And it's the National Wildlife Federation that's organizing and paying for that trip. But anybody who lives in any of those 4 border states, Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Washington, I'd add to Jarred's list, contact your governor. That's one of the things we're focused on here in Washington, is there's a really strong relationship between Washington State and British Columbia. A lot of tourism, a lot of commerce, a lot of business cooperation. They need us, we need them. And that relationship politically between Victoria and Olympia is really important. And it's not very neighborly for British Columbia to be ruining transboundary rivers and exposing our downstream communities and resources to these impacts. And Governor Inslee needs to know that from his citizens, and he needs to amplify that to the Premier in Victoria and demand regulatory changes. But to what Jarred was saying, I think that the Colville tribes, not just because they're downstream and their territory is affected by what happens on the Similkameen, but because the BC First Nations, those 2 Similkameen Indian bands I've been mentioning, are relatives of the Colvilles. They're part of the Okanagan tribe, which is one of the Colville Confederation. I think the Colville tribe deserves a seat at the table for all of those consultations and required consent with the mine. And I believe that the U.S. federal government as trustee for the tribes and EPA deserves a seat at that table and should be demanding it. So those are some of the things that we hope will evolve out of this process.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. I forgot to mention our DC trip coming up. So we're doing on that front. I was just back there not long, meeting with DOI Assistant Secretary under Deb Holland about some other issues. But my federal lobbyist is working on some other meetings outside of the ones Mitch has scheduled with as well to meet with some others, and I'll bring up some of these issues as well, because we're trying to do that on our side of the border, but a lot of that also takes pressure on the other side of the border too. But they can also put pressure on some of those, like Governor Inslee, like he mentioned, can also put pressure on them to, because it is good to be a good neighbor, right? And so I just want to state that. So,
well, I was going to give Mitch a little hell about Jarred a little hell. Like did he put you up to saying, Conservation Northwest is the one, you got to check them out? And then Mitch jumped to saying National Wildlife Federation is the one. So I had to hold back a little there, but I got one more question before we transition out of here, because I think there's one thing that I'm just kind of keep getting at, like what so far has the BC government or the Canadian government said to the people advocating for this or talking about this? Are they listening? Are they just kind of pushing it off? Give us a sense of is anything happening with them?
As far as the tribe goes, we haven't, as far as I know, haven't been reached out to from them to discuss this in particular. We've seen, I think, some movements from the mine, right, or even the government, maybe a little bit there as far as people, inspectors, right? I don't know if Mitch, you want to touch on that at all? We got some word on that, but other than that, we haven't been contacted directly. We might need to send a letter or something to have a more formal conversation about it. So we haven't talked about that yet much, but it's always something. And usually they have to reply in some sort of format. Not always, but because our Snipes, they're a transboundary tribe and that are recognized, but so is the Okanagan, but it's hard to, like Mitch described, there's the Okanagan in Canada, there's Okanagan, our tribe in Washington. We're all related, but we're different in that we're because of the border, right? And so anyways.
Well, there's a local and then there's a regional. At the regional, at the regulatory level, BC is adopting some better regulations on financial assurances, the bonding issue, on environmental assessment, on mineral tenure reform. Do mining rights last forever? Can the public get their land back? They're not to where we think they ought to be. We got to keep pushing, but there's some progress made. And at the local level, I'll tell you, it sure seems like the Ministry of Mines and other things, all these ministries are big buckets of things now. But the Ministry of Mines and such is paying more attention. There's a lot more communication in the last couple months with Copper Mountain Mine, with the local First Nations. That's good to see. It doesn't feel like the tone is right yet. What I'm hearing secondhand is that the deputy ministers are more disputing the stuff in our reports. And what's really troubling, I keep mentioning our main, consulting engineer, Emmerman, who did that report on the annual probability of failure. The ministry and the mine seem to keep picking at the facts that he used, the data that he used in his conclusions. But he got all of his data, all of his information from the mine and the reports that they paid their own consultants for. So it's almost a misdirection. It's like the mine is trying to blame the messenger rather than address a message. So there's more work to be done here. Lots more.
Well, thanks for that, Mitch. I think what we'll try to do here is wrap it up, and appreciate your time. And this is a complicated one. It's obviously not one you could just have a quick hour conversation about and figure it all out. So please do send us links and other resources where we can send folks. But I'll give everyone a chance to leave us with some wise words. What do you want to say, Mitch? I'll just go back to you. What do you want to say as far as leaving folks with the take-home message here?
Well, this has been a gratifying experience for me, a rewarding experience working with the First Nations and the Colville tribes and the other tribes from Alaska to Montana. And it's been rewarding not just for me, but for all of the tribal and First Nation people. They're meeting their cousins and relatives and people in same circumstances. They're getting empowered from knowing they're not alone and elevating their voices together. And it's just another example of the lesson that we can make change. You just got to keep battling, got to be strategic. Got to have durability. Stay in it for the long term because it's worth it. I've seen a lot of change. We've accomplished a lot over the years. Washington and the Northwest is wilder than it was 30 years ago. We've got Fisher here. We've got lynx here. We've got Wolverine here. We've got wolves here. These things were not here 30 years ago. So even as our population and economy are booming, we've saved our old growth. We've saved our roadless areas. We can make things better. We don't have to trash nature to have a good civilization, good economy. But it's a long fight. You got to stay in it.
I don't know what else to say to that. That's a good balancing statement, right? Like we can kind of have it all, right? I mean, we can if we do it smartly and wisely. And I think back to what Jarred said too earlier, 7 generations. Let's keep in mind and always have that on the forefront of our mind that whatever we do impacts the future. And if we can't leave the future something good, then we're doing something wrong. Jarred, give us some wise words. Leave us with your thoughts.
I don't know about wise, but I'll do my best. Just a little backstory. So when I was a technician at Fish and Wildlife, as a formality, I went back to school to get my degree, and just because I had that piece of paper right to show that what I knew. But a lot of what I knew was just from being on the land, from I would say some common sense, and then some of my teachings from my ancestors and my elders, and of what should be done and why, right? And so that's what we go back to the teachings of 7 generations ahead, thinking of your children and grandchildren, how these are going to impact the decisions we make today. So that's kind of why I want to leave people with, try to leave it better than we left it, right? I mean, we all love the outdoors that are listening to this. So we all love fish. We all love wildlife. Let's leave it wild. Let's the best we can and live with the land and not against it on these things. So that's kind of what I like to leave it with, I suppose, today. And appreciate everyone listening. And if ever a time you would like to talk, Aaron, about the Upper Columbia and salmon reintroduction, that's a big conversation that I think would get a lot of people interested in what we got going on in the Upper Columbia. It's a big project, and it's a big push for. We haven't had salmon up there in 80 years, some places 100 years. So getting that back and our reconnection to our a lot of our local tribes as well that have been without them for that long. It's been a big spiritual reconnection as well, but also the impacts of how it impacts everyone in Alaska. The more fish in the Columbia is more fish in the whole system. They all go by everyone else before they get to us. Helping with the orca, right? The orca issue with the lack of salmon. So if you ever want to have a conversation about that, I'd more than willing to have that and have some of our biologists jump on with me as well to help explain some of that, even from the other tribes, the Yukut tribes, the Upper Columbia United tribes. So.
Thanks for that offer. Maybe one day I'll get an invite to come visit from Mitch or you guys together and come see some of this stuff, because I sure love that part of the world and would love to see all the good work you're doing. Well, Bill, what about you? You want to leave us with any wise words?
Sure. And this is something I've mentioned a lot of times. We've talked a lot about the need for local and regional pressure and outreach to get folks' opinions to their elected leaders and to make change. Not being from the area and knowing a whole lot of our listeners aren't from the area, it's not going to stop me when in November I'm speaking to some of my own elected officials to say, hey, that's our border up there and it's important. And the risk of sending this toxic sludge across our border is something we nationally should be speaking about. So that's where I'm coming from on it right now.
Well, thanks, Bill. You guys all said all the good stuff, so I'm just going to let this one head on out. And we appreciate all of your time. Thank you, Jarred. Thank you, Mitch. Keep fighting the good fight. Keep us updated. We'll be happy to put stuff out on our channels about the good work you're doing and keep updating our folks. And hopefully you'll keep letting us know where we can push and prod and try to get the best outcome out of this. And just thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thanks a ton, Aaron, Bill.
Thanks for having us.
Enjoyed it.
For more great content, check out NWF Outdoors social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Connect with us. We want to hear from you. Send us your ideas for podcast guests and questions in the comments.
We are NWF Outdoors.